Good morning and welcome to Supply Chain Now Radio. We are broadcasting live today from the supply chain capital of the country, Atlanta, Georgia. My name is Scott Luton. I'm your host for today's session. In our webinar today, we're going to be talking best practices for identifying true demand and using all the critical data at your disposal for exemplary customer service. Our featured speaker today will be Joel Beal, co-founder and CEO at Alloy. More about Joel in just a moment. But as always, we're glad to have you with us here today on Supply Chain Now Radio. So let's tackle our ground rules real quick. All of our attendees will be on mute as we're looking to optimize the audio experience. Now, with that said, let's make it as interactive as possible. So please do submit your questions via the chat toolbar. We'll answer as many as we have time for at the conclusion of today's webinar. Finally, a PDF of today's presentation and the recording will be sent out in the next few days to each of our registrants. So let's take a minute to recognize our sponsors here on Supply Chain Now Radio. Big thanks to our sponsor, Apex Atlanta, which has been serving the Metro Atlanta community since 1964. For those of you new to Apex, it is a premier industry association dedicated to end-to-end supply chain management. Around the world, our organization serves over 45,000 members. Apex offers membership and professional development, a wide range of education opportunities, industry-leading research and publications, and widely recognized professional certifications. To learn more, visit us at apexatlanta.org. Special thanks to our sponsor, TalentStream, a WeBank-certified recruiting and staffing firm that specializes in helping organizations find top talent in the engineering, the manufacturing, and the supply chain space. Did you know TalentStream has averaged a 45-day time to fill on its core job searches in 2018? Contact us today to put that V8 search engine to work for your organization. To learn more, visit us at talentstreamstaffing.com. Okay, so our audience is in for a treat today. Let me share a little more information about our featured speaker. Joel Beal is co-founder and CEO of Alloy. Prior to this role, Joel served as VP of Product at Adipar, a financial analytics company. He has also worked at Applied Predictive Technologies, which specializes in business analytics software for large consumer-facing businesses. Joel holds an MA in economics from Stanford University, go Cardinal, and a BA in economics and mathematics from Columbia University. If you would, please join me in welcoming Mr. Joel Beal.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate that. Appreciate the shout out for the Cardinal. Hasn't been the best year for the football team, but appreciate that nonetheless. So excited to be joining all of you today, and appreciate the time that you're taking out of your schedules to join us. And hopefully we'll be able to share some thoughts, some of the things that we've learned and have found work for helping companies to connect better to their end customers. By way of the agenda, I'll be starting out by speaking a bit about what is kind of downstream demand, how's it defined, what is it, what's available, and why this type of information is critical for your business and helping you to operate better. Then we'll talk about best practices that we found around how to best prepare and report on that data, use it in your forecasting, your planning, your predictive analytics, and ultimately align your organization so that you can drive decision making in a more demand-driven way. I'll finish off with some ideas about how you get started in this journey, no matter where you are in it, and we will end with some Q&A. So as we kick things off, we have a little bit of a survey to make things a little more interactive to start out with. So I'll turn it over to Scott for that.
Great. Hey, thanks, Joel. So to our audience, we want to get some input on the front end of the presentation here. So we're going to launch this poll, and I will read it here to you. So what are your team's biggest demand-related challenges? So check all that apply. First answer is out of stocks. The second answer is forecast accuracy. Third, replenishment and customer service levels, followed by new product introductions, and then promotion management. So take the next 10 seconds or so, select all that apply, and then we'll share the results with the audience here. A few more seconds. Last call. All right, so let's close and share what we have here. So Joel, I'm not sure if you can view this, but forecast accuracy was up at the top, 89%. followed by replenishment and customer service levels at 47%, new product introductions 42%, promotion management at 32%, and coming in last was out of stocks at 21%. Thanks to our audience for participating. Joel, back to you.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, interesting to see that. It's fun to see it in real time as they come in. Also very interesting to see how that compares actually to, there's been a lot of surveys over time around how suppliers are using downstream data, kind of this demand data within their organization. And oddly enough, number one is out of stocks, which I think was the lowest for this particular group. So interesting why that would be. But out of stocks is kind of the number one way people are using to try to reduce those. Second is in that forecasting and replenishment piece, right, which looks like we're the kind of the 1 and 2 from this group, followed by better managing new product introductions and promotion management. Now, I imagine some of these will probably vary based on, whether we have more of a supply chain crew, whether we have people coming more from the sales organization, account management, but interesting to see the variation there. So I want to start by talking about what is demand? Because there are a lot of different ways that you can measure it. There are a lot of different types of demand. And ultimately, kind of from top to bottom here, as you work, obviously every company's different. Some control their end distribution. Others are working with third parties. But demand really can range from, the shipments and the orders that you're receiving from your buyers through the end kind of point of sale and e-commerce data that's showing what that end customer is doing as they walk into, potentially a retail outlet or order online, all the way down to, things that are really anticipating demand. Things like social sentiment or pre-orders that are indicating a desire to buy, but something that hasn't been actualized yet, right, at the actual point of purchase. And all these things are valid types of demand, right? They're all important. And, most frequently when you talk, saying, hey, forecasting is the number one thing people are trying to improve, by better understanding customer demand. Well, the most common thing that people use in forecasting is that top level, right? Shipments and orders. One thing to keep in mind with this data, right, as you kind of work your way down, the data at the top is usually the easiest to get, right? It's data that's readily available. The data there in the middle is really, a sweet spot that we would argue is where everyone should make sure they are at least at a minimum, right? Is understanding, what's happening as that end customer is purchasing your products through your various distribution channels and getting a keyed in on that. And then there's obviously the things that are happening in anticipation, the social sentiment and the pre-orders. Now, when we talk about things like pre-orders, that data is not always as readily available as the data up high. It can be captured in various ways for things like subscription services really are a form of a pre-order as well. If that's certainly a business model more people are experimenting with, a way of trying to get, more certainty around what a customer is about to do that certainly can help you plan and forecast better. I think an important thing to note, though, particularly as we talk about that middle section around point of sale and e-commerce that we'll talk a lot about today, is when you are collecting this information, it is often coming in a constrained way, if you will, right? The data that you're receiving from point of sale and e-commerce oftentimes isn't taking into account, for example, out of stocks, right? It's a constrained indication of what people are buying based on the inventory that's available to them. And so as you look at that demand data, you need to be keeping in mind that it needs to be adjusted accordingly, all right? You want to take into account the fact that they're out of stocks, that oftentimes the numbers that may be reported to you are going to be net versus gross. And so you want to make those adjustments to make sure you're accurately painting a picture of, assuming your end consumer could get all the product they want, how much would they be asking from you, which is really what you should be trying to forecast and work with. So by way of an example on this front, we work with a major home goods company. They were releasing a new product over the holidays, right, which was a big time of year for them, as it probably is for many of you. As the product was going out, immediately they were seeing, a spike in out of stocks. One of the challenges was, as they looked at the forecast that was being provided and the plan by the retailer, there was actually a gap between what the retailer was forecasting and what they were seeing based on the point of sale. And essentially all of that could be accounted for, or the vast majority of it based off, it didn't appear that the retailer was making proper adjustments for the out of stocks that were already quite high. The total amount of this difference ended up being a couple $1 million in product, right? So it was a significant amount that was there. It was demand that was apparent, but needed to be adjusted for accordingly. So the other kind of axis that you want to be looking at, there's granularity of the demand in terms of, am I getting my orders and shipments, or I'm getting all the way down to, kind of the purchase or pre-purchase behavior. The other thing that you want to be looking at is how granular is the demand data that you're getting. Oftentimes, people start by just measuring this across an entire retailer or distributor, right? And aggregate what is happening, right? I get kind of the aggregated numbers of demand by SKU, but I really don't have visibility in where that demand is. As you work your way down, you might be able to start to see things by region, then into the location level, the distribution centers and the stores, and kind of the holy grail is understanding the exact customer that's coming in and purchasing the product. Now, one of the things to keep in mind as your data gets more granular is it grows exponentially, right? As I work my way down this list, the amount of data that I'm going to be collecting is going to grow by orders of magnitude, right? I go from that single line item for this is what I'm doing in Walmart to all of a sudden I have, over 4,200 in the United States stores and distribution centers that are reporting, right? So my data has grown by an order of 4,200 when I start to collect it at that point, right? Obviously, if I can go down to the customer level, which oftentimes you're not going to be able to get from partners, but you will get if you're the one who's doing kind of, drop shipping or shipping directly to that customer, the data is going to grow even exponentially from there. So there's a lot more, data that's possible here. And a lot of opportunities that I'm going to speak about here in a minute as you work your way down and get more granular demand data. Now, one thing also to keep in mind with this is you're not going to get the same thing from everyone, right? And as we kind of start talking about best practices, in some cases, all you're going to get is a high-level understanding of what demand looks like. In other cases, you might be able to get down to the individual location and customer. The key thing is trying to collect as much granular data as you can, because it really, we've seen, can drive a lot of value. To give you an idea, though, of the types of value that starts to become available as you work your way down on this, we work with kind of a leading global CPG company. They do vendor managed inventory across their major retail partners. They're quite advanced in how they do it. They take into account really most of the best practices. But one of their challenges, and the reason that they engaged with us, was they were having problems with out of stocks during promotions. They were finding kind of a repeated pattern of out of stocks happening towards the tail end of promotions that they wanted to get a hold of. They weren't understanding why they couldn't be more responsive. And ultimately, the challenge for them was their visibility was limited to the distribution center, right? They saw the inventory there. They saw all the pulls that were happening from the DC. The data within the stores was actually available, but it wasn't a part of the process that they were running at the time. And so when promotions were overperforming, often they were seeing that there was a 5 to 6 day gap between that happening in the stores and them understanding it, because they would see those pulls start to show up in the DCs. So as we engaged with them, really there were two things that we were able to do. The first was to create alerts that were happening that immediately sensed, once you bring in that store level data, you understand which stores are associated with which DCs. You can alert stores that are overperforming expectation, right? Seeing what's actually happening at the store, making that alert, which is, cutting down that lag time and understanding that that DC is likely to see, greater demand from the stores because they're outperforming. But the second point was perhaps even more interesting. It's diagnosing why that particular issue is happening, right? If I'm having an out of stock, is it because the store tried to make an order from a DC, which our customer hadn't adequately stocked because that was their responsibility, in which case those units were not fillable? Or was it a case where the store just wasn't making the pull as necessary, right? The inventory was there, but they hadn't made the pull in anticipation or in response to the demand spike. And it turned out in this particular case that over 50% of the issue was actually because the stores themselves, we could diagnose, actually had access to the inventory from the DCs. They just weren't replenishing accordingly. So, this is one of those examples of, something that's not possible. Certainly they were doing a lot better by having DC visibility than if they didn't. But once you added in the store level granularity, you were able to really diagnose the reasons for these issues. And that's really, I think, the key story as you think about granularity is, if I just get those top level numbers, if all I understand is that my in-stock rate is 95%, I really can't dive into understanding, well, is that 5%, where is it? How much of it is addressable? How much is it costing me? Unless I can really see the individual locations that are impacted. So in terms of the benefits, I talked through a couple stories of ways that we've seen people get value from this. But the benefits really align. There's obviously the customer service side of this, which is making sure that you can fill the orders that your trading partners are going to make from you by understanding in advance, what's actually happening with the product within those channels. And so that allows you to kind of better anticipate and make sure you have the product available. There's certainly a whole level there in the middle, though, of helping, like in that past example. Part of it could be addressed by our client, right, by improving when they were replenishing the DC, but there was half of it or more that only could be addressed by working with their retail partner to better replenish those stores. And so, that's a process. Everybody's busy, and you're the most incentivized to take care of your own products. And so having that visibility so that you can help be a better partner and making sure your products are better managed, with obviously the end goal of this does allow, both top line growth by making sure that we have the products where the customers want them, while reducing excess inventory, because you can understand, where your inventory is downstream, where you have enough and where you have too little. So in terms of some of the specific things to put some numbers against what we've seen, and there's a lot of research on this. If you do some quick Google searches, I think every major consulting firm has lots of white papers outlining benefits of really, keying in on that end customer better. Forecast accuracy, which I know was the kind of the top point that was brought up in the poll within this group, is certainly an area where there's going to be, immediate benefit. You really want to take into account all the different types of data. The thing with kind of modern statistical software is it can, use everything from the orders and the shipments, the point of sale, on down to those pre-orders and the social sentiment, if you have it, to increase your overall accuracy. And as we'll talk about in a minute, also allow you to forecast in a much more continuous way, right? Really reduce the lead times in your forecasting, your planning itself. We've seen pretty dramatic improvements in fill rates across those people that our customers sell to. This middle one is an example of a customer we worked with, a small consumer electronics brand that was able to increase their fill rate from the low 90s to the upper 90s by just better anticipating what their partners were going to do. And lastly, as I've spoken a lot about, really reducing out of stocks by honing in on better opportunities to replenishment and getting ahead of spikes in demand. So if there's all this value, why isn't everybody doing a better job of this, right? And the key thing here is because it's hard. This is something that's been talked about for a long time. It's really hard to pull all this data together in a meaningful way. I think, as we talk to folks in the industry, I think there's, a decent amount heartache at attempts that have been made that sometimes don't seem like they paid off as much as was hoped, and as potentially as much as possible. And I think the challenges really fall within three different areas. One is access. This is really the starting point of what data is available. This is data that's generally outside of your own four walls. It's data that you need to collect from partners. Now, some of that, you might, as more and more companies are selling direct, might be more readily available, but oftentimes you have to, work with distributors, retailers, other partners that you sell through to collect this data. They're not incentivized to necessarily make this easy for you to collect it and normalize it. So they're all going to have their own systems, their own ways of sharing it, whether that's EDI or custom portals they've built, or far often than I would like to admit, just Excel reports that are being sent. So the data is pretty inconsistent. There's legacy systems that we're working with. It's not seamless to pull it together, and you really have to start by using the data that you have, and then trying to oftentimes encourage people to share more. The second thing, as I mentioned, is you're going to be collecting a whole lot more data the deeper you go into this, right? As you move from, for example, just collecting it at a channel level to going down to the individual locations or even down to the customers where possible, that data is growing a lot. There are more tools than ever to do data analysis, but it certainly can often lead to data paralysis. And this is a real thing where, so much data can really do two things. If you're not well equipped to handle it, you don't have the right tools, you don't have the right process and the right people, ultimately it's overwhelming, and it probably actually distracts from the end goal. And so you've got to make sure that you're set up to use that data. And as I talk about best practices, I'll have some ideas there to avoid, data paralysis. And, kind of this aggregate metrics, diving deeper than the high level, kind of key metrics that, the high level numbers, the value is in getting into the detail and identifying the opportunities there. The last challenge is around, actioning. And even if I can do the first two, I need to make sure that my organization is set up to actually be able to respond quickly. The whole goal of this is to be able to respond to customer demand, to have better end customer service, and my organization needs to be able to react to that. We need to kind of move out of the organizational silos that often exist, that often silo this data itself. We need to create the right incentives and KPIs and the right workflows to be able to act on this. One specific example that we've seen actually across a number of customers who've gone across this journey with us, is, for example, a sales team will shift their compensation and their incentive structure from basically orders into end customer sell-through. And that's just one way that you start to shift the mindset, right, of a company to say what really matters. What matters at the end of the day is, are we putting product in the place that our customers will buy it? And that's how we should all be, incentivized and compensated. Okay, so I'm going to shift over and talking now about some of the best practices that we found as you work with this data. So one of the key things is, as I mentioned, you'll be collecting a lot of information as you go on this journey and as you get more granular. And you really need a platform that's scalable, that can handle, one, all the different types of information you're going to be bringing in, right? The orders and the shipments, and direct transactional data you have of your customer is going to be structured in a very different way than a weekly or a daily report on point of sale, at a specific location. But you want to be able to include all that information. You want to be able to also bring in other demand drivers, which I'll talk about in a minute as well, into a single data source. And this is such an important point because oftentimes things go awry because there are so many different versions of the truth. Different people are looking at different data. And you can have, by the way, we see it quite oftentimes, the the same partner that actually provides you two different versions of data. They themselves might not be aligned on what demand looks like on their side. So you really need to kind of choose how you want to set things up. You need to align your organization on a single source of truth, and it has to be able to handle data at scale. I think big data is a term that's been way overused, but you're going to be collecting a lot of data. That's the opportunity here, is to make use of this data that's out there. But you obviously need something that can kind of handle that volume. So by, the simple math here is if I have 400 SKUs, if I'm across 50,000 inventory carrying locations, and I'm on average collecting 10 types of, 10 data points, per location and SKU, that's 1.4 billion data points a week, right? Just for that. So it's going to grow really quickly. This is not something you can handle in Excel. And so you're going to want to make sure that you're thinking through that and you have something that's performant there. The second thing is putting as much automation as place as is possible. So once again, I've spent, when Scott kind of gave the introduction on myself, I spent my entire career, both, academically and in the business world, really doing analytics. And sad to say on that, the amount of time I've spent doing really sophisticated analytical work versus the amount of time that I've done doing data janitor work is the reverse of what I would like. I actually think this middle point of 50 to 80% of data scientists or analyst time is spent on data janitor work is probably pretty conservative. I would definitely say it's more on the 80% time. You're constantly cleaning up data and dealing with the fact that you're trying to understand the outliers, all the different things that are coming in. This is obviously going to become even more extreme the more data that you're collecting. And so, automation is a key part of this, right? It's saying, how do I, aggregate that data, cleanse it, and harmonize it so I have that single source of truth that can be used. Automation is obviously not always an easy thing to do, but I think the other key value is it gives you consistency in saying, okay, this is the data, this is the process we go through in cleaning it up, and so we can be, confident in what it is. It's not going to be perfect. There are still going to be issues. That will always be the case, but at least we all have agreed on, what that process looks like. And ultimately, spreadsheets are great. Big fan. I've spent a lot of time in Excel, more time than I'd like to count there as well. But understand where they're good and where they're not as good. They're not good for this part of the process, right? They can be good for that end kind of ad hoc analysis because they provide so much flexibility. They're not good data repositories, and they're not good for running regular processes because they're so liable to have errors. So this was, I think, a consulting firm found 88% of them, have an error or something within them. So I'm sure that's something many of you have experienced. Okay, so the other thing here is, as you collect this data and use it, making sure that you're providing tailored insights that align to kind of the function and the level of the person that's consuming them. So I want to focus a little bit actually on the right-hand side. Again, I know there's more of a supply chain audience, but talking a little bit about something that we've seen within sales organizations on this, because I think it makes it quite clear. What a global VP of sales is going to be looking at when they're trying to understand demand globally. They're going to want a level of detail that's obviously far different than the account managers and the territory resellers that are working in a more detailed way. So we have one customer, right, who runs global sales for a large consumer electronics company. His daily workflow is coming in and looking basically at biggest opportunities and biggest risks for his business, right, on a daily basis. That doesn't mean that all the data is coming in daily. They have some data that is, some data that isn't. But coming in and understanding where those are, he's going to have a target that he's trying to hit by the end of the quarter, and then a kind of a continuous projection around how is he doing versus that target. And what are the gaps? What are the opportunities to kind of improve performance? So some of that might be identifying, and trying to, put a number against, okay, where are we missing forecasts? And then it's going to be up to, the account managers to drill and understand why, right? He's just going to direct their attention to saying, hey, this is the opportunity. It feels like we're leaving a lot on the table. We're missing our forecasts. I'm seeing that, to use the out of stock example again, because it's oftentimes just such a clear way of defining value, that our out of stock and our lost sales numbers are quite high. Can we dive in and figure out what's going to happen? The account manager then can drill in, go into each of the different accounts, go down to the location level and figure out where they can direct their time. So, make sure that, in this idea of avoiding analysis paralysis, make sure that, each function and each level has, the right level of insights for them and for their role, and isn't distracted by things that ultimately, is going to keep them from being focused on those things that matter most. The next one is as we go more into forecasting, which I know is something that many of you are interested in. So what this data really allows you to do is become more demand driven in how you forecast. You want to be able to do continuous forecasting, right? I mean, this data is coming in frequently. How can I make sure that my forecasting is adjusting as soon as the latest information is there? And the other thing is trying to do this at all the levels. And this requires definitely a huge level of automation, but making sure that I can both do my high level forecasting, but also have forecasting that's going down to the lowest level of data that I get. And so that I can also identify clear opportunities there. Another thing that I'll mention that we've seen with forecasting is one of the most frequent questions that I'll get is, what are all the other types of drivers that we can bring in to improve our forecasting, right? I think there's a lot of interest in bringing outside data. Weather is one that comes up all the time. Now, a lot of these things can drive value. They require additional work. You've got to bring that data in, harmonize it together. But there's no doubt that in certain cases it can be a big opportunity. It's oftentimes, though, not the lowest hanging fruit for you. And this is why I think bringing in additional point of sale customer demand data is probably going to be the best bang for your buck for improving your forecast accuracy. I happen to know that if you sell pizzas, right, weather is super important. If it rains, you're going to sell a lot more pizza, right? But for probably a lot of your products, weather at the end of the day doesn't matter that much. Right? Or if it does, it's going to matter for specific, products. And so a lot of the opportunity here is decreasing the amount of time, bringing up the data that you're using for forecasting and planning. And so it's as close to real time with what consumers are doing as possible, right? So I was speaking with someone a couple weeks ago. They actually were very interested in finding which kind of external data sources could be used to drive demand. They hired a consulting firm that did analysis and was looking for correlations for all sorts of different outside variables. Really, at the end of the day, they found this was a product that I would have thought might have been impacted by things like weather, but they found that the effects were actually quite small. But they were also explaining to me that their forecasting process used demand data, used point of sale data, but it was demand data that was 2 months old, right, when they started their process, and it was a multi-week process to run planning. So that's a huge opportunity to tighten that gap where I think you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck. The other thing in terms of forecasts is making sure that you are not overwhelming people. As I said, if you're doing this continuous forecasting, if you can do it at all these different levels, once again, this is similar to that tailored insights. Make sure that people have the level of detail they need around these forecasts. The forecasts become the input into helping us make smarter decisions, right? So there are going to be some people who are going to be interested in looking, regularly at what are my forecasted sales, how's that doing versus actuals. I want to be looking at the deltas there and making adjustments. For other people, it's going to be far more interesting to see the end result of that forecast, right? They don't need to know all the details. What they need to see is, highlighted examples where shipping delays are likely to cause problems because we're forecasting that our inventory is going to run out if the product isn't getting there on time. So, as with all of this information, if I'm collecting so much more, think about who needs what and who needs what level of detail so that you're not overwhelming them. Okay, the last point is, in many cases, I think one of the most important here. And I think it aligns with the point that I think I'm making over and over again, which is you're going to be collecting a lot more data as you go on this journey. And that's the direction I think every company is going through right now. And it's a journey you absolutely should be embracing, right? But we're going, it goes from collecting more data, and that data, the outcome is either it's going to further focus me on my opportunities because now I'm able to see them in much more detail, or it's going to distract me because I have that analysis paralysis. And the best way to probably handle this is to start to shift your organization to manage by exception, right? Put as many things on autopilot as possible. I know that's sometimes easier said than done, but figure out those places where you can have automation that is good enough, right? That's working, and so you can focus on flagging, opportunities, that are outside the norm, and having, a smart way of being alerted to those so that you can really drill in to where, the biggest opportunities lie. So to kind of end on this, in terms of getting started, right? This is, I imagine those on the call are at different stages in this journey, and that's to be expected. So the first thing to do is, identify, where to start, evaluate where you are, are you collecting this data at all? How available is it? How sophisticated are and how you're using it. I think the key advice that I always give on this is don't try to boil the ocean, if you will, right? Don't try to solve everything at once. It's very easy to, I think, get on this path, get excited about all the potential, and then, stop yourself from making any changes because it ultimately becomes such a big shift. So, I think the key thing here is look at the existing processes and tools that you have and try to align something that works with them. Pick, the nice thing is data availability tends to be the best with the biggest opportunities, right? So that's another thing we see is often people will say, hey, I want to get perfect coverage and see every bit of demand. Oftentimes it's a couple of partners that, are responsible for the bulk of your demand. So focus on them. The data is probably the easiest to get there, and align it with what you already have in place. And so you're making those incremental steps. Allow that to, allow yourself to see the results from that, and hopefully that will drive further adoption as people see the power of connecting to your customers better. The second part of this, which I touched on a little bit at the beginning, is verifying and securing data access. You probably have access to more data than you may think, and this is something that there at the end we talk about partnering with experts. Talk to people that work with that partner, because there may be more data that's available that you just aren't taking advantage of. Sometimes you do have to go ask for it. Sometimes it's just there. But obviously you have to figure out where the data is and how hard it's going to be to get additional data. And I think the third one's really important, especially as we're going into Q4 for probably many of you right now, is as you're planning for 2019, you're going to have strategic initiatives. And, tie this to one of those initiatives, because I can almost guarantee you that one, if not most or all of them, are probably going to be impacted by this in some way. Better understanding that customer is going to be able to help you address those key initiatives, and that will help you to get champions, who can help you push this. Because as we talked about those challenges, parts about getting the data, it's about having the right process and tools, and really shifting your organization to think in a different way than maybe they do today. And then the last one is finding experts. And there's a lot of people out there, whether this is, talking to people at other companies or within your own company who have more experience with this. Oftentimes we'll find that some teams are further along than others. That gets into the data silo aspect of maybe you find out, wait a minute, my sales team already has a bunch of this data, but I've never seen it. right? And so, working with experts within your company, at other companies, consulting firms, technology firms, there's many people out there that can probably jumpstart you on this journey. So with that, I will. I've left a bit of time here for Q&A, and I'll turn the time back over to Scott for some questions.
Great. Hey, thanks so much, Joel. And just like he said to our audience, we've got a good bit of time for Q&A, which is oftentimes not to take anything away from the presentation, but it's one of the most enjoyable aspects of these webinars. So we want to hear your questions. We'll pose those to Joel. Please use the chat toolbar to submit those questions, and then we'll pose those to Joel as we move along here. So Joel, we've got some great questions teed up. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. First question comes from Leah. And Leah asks, why is it important to have store level data?
Yeah, great question. And something that we hear a lot. So I think I'll share a story. I think stories often illustrate the points the best. I think the difference is when you get those aggregated, metrics, you may, you're going to see overall demand, across an entire partner level. That's going to be helpful for, planning purposes oftentimes. But sorry, I'm just going to pull something up here. But the key thing here is you really can't often diagnose issues unless you can go down to the individual location. So one example I can share is another consumer electronics brand that we worked with. They were selling through a major consumer electronics retailer. They would get aggregate out of stock numbers, right? And they, had hunches about where it was occurring, but they didn't know for sure because they didn't have store level. Happens to be that this retailer readily provides that. It just wasn't something they were taking into account. Once they were able to bring that data into account, they were able to quickly flag, okay, while in aggregate, maybe a 95% in-stock level is fine, those 5% oftentimes of out of stocks are driving a disproportionate amount of revenue. So this is something to keep in mind is even though I'm 5% out of stock, it doesn't mean that my lost sales are 5%. It might actually be quite a bit higher because oftentimes the highest performing locations go out of stock more. And in this case, they were really able to go to that retailer, show them where replenishment was wrong. So it's similar to that example I shared with that CPG company earlier, and ultimately address the core issue. The other thing, since I know there was a lot of interest in forecasting, if you can start to forecast down into different regions and geographies, that also can be interesting. You can start to see, sub-trends that are happening that often allow you to better anticipate what's going to happen in the future, right? Identify localized events, right? If I'm, running localized promotions or marketing, or there are going to be, holidays that have more of an impact in one area or another. So that's another thing is forecasting can also really benefit from increased granularity.
Great. Thank you, Joel. And great question, Leah. And again, to our audience, we're going to take the next 10 minutes or so to pose questions. So here's your opportunity to get some free consulting with Joel Beal. So next question comes from Tamika. Joel, how do you forecast new product introductions?
Yeah, so a great one as well. So new product introductions, I think there's a number of ways that you want to think about them, right? And I think it's probably the number one challenge oftentimes when it comes to forecasting. So the one element is you're going to probably try to look for similar products and how they performed and what that ramp up has looked like historically. So other new product introductions that you have, you want to be able to kind of identify those, look at those ramp up curves. You're going to want to understand, this gets back into the location level again, is, ramps can look differently depending on, is this a nationwide ramp? Is it happening in certain regions first? So taking all those things into account, but the best thing with forecasting is always to see other examples of how things are performed. The other thing we would say with new product introductions is one of the, and this is where I think this demand data is so important, is you want to be able to respond very, very quickly when things differ from expectations. You're going to forecast them incorrectly, you're going to forecast everything incorrectly, sadly. But new product introductions are likely to have a bigger margin of error, even if you're doing all these things right. You've seen other similar products ramp up. So the key thing here is how quickly can I respond? I was chatting with the CEO of a company a couple weeks ago, and he was sharing the example of new product was introduced. They already had a production plan in place. They collect demand data, from a lot of partners, but they had on Amazon, they were getting it daily, and they were able to see even just within the first couple days within Amazon that it was outperforming, and they decided that they wanted to make that bet that was happening more broadly, and they started to shift production, that quickly. So the key thing is that happened within a couple days of the release, and already seeing things differ from plan. Shortening that window is going to be, so it's both, you try to forecast it better, but you also try to make sure that you can respond a lot more quickly.
Great question, Tamika. Appreciate your insight there, Joel. Next question comes from Daniel. And Daniel asks a good question here. How do you manage demand increase from customers against manufacturing capability?
Yeah, so, let's see. You're going to have some constraints, right, with manufacturing oftentimes. And, there's questions about overall capacity. There's going to be how responsive am I in being able to shift production schedules. And I think this all comes down to understanding for your business, what are the lead times that you need to be able to respond, right? That's a constraint that you have in this process. And I don't think that should, as you think about that, it's, whatever that may be, right? Is that 4 weeks? Is that 12 weeks? Is that, an apparel, it can be 9 months, right? For someone to be able to respond, it's a very long time frame. But within that, the key, once again, to me is making sure if you have that pulse of consumer demand, right, it's going to allow you, though, to get the data to start making the shifts now. Now, it still may not take effect for a certain period of time, right? Because you have those constraints, just with the way that your supply chain is structured, and your lead times. But it's still a difference of, am I making the adjustment tomorrow, or am I making the adjustment 3 weeks from now, right? Because I don't see that this demand change is happening. And that 3 weeks is going to impact you, right? Even if there's still a 12-week delay on you being able to respond to it. So, in that sense, I think the other thing that it can do that we've talked and we've seen a lot of companies start to shift is, as their mindset adjusts, you can start to think about changing your supply chain so that you can be more responsive from a production standpoint. We talk to more customers who are thinking about shifting production, bringing certain parts of it, closer to where customer demand is, so that they have some part of it that they can spin up and down faster than maybe bringing in things from overseas. That's obviously a longer term change. But I think you get started by showing people, hey, this is what's possible. This is how much faster we can see what a customer is doing. And then we need to start aligning the organization and changing it around that.
Terrific. Great question, Daniel. Thanks for the insight, Joel. And again, to our audience, use the chat toolbar to pose the questions, and we'll take the next couple minutes here to pose those to Joel Beal. This question comes from Roger, and Roger asks, what are the more advanced uses of downstream data?
Yeah, so the more advanced uses of it. So I think what we usually see is you start out with, it kind of goes on that, if I even go back to, this slide a bit. Generally, what we see is, you get more advanced as you get closer to the customer, right? You move from more aggregated metrics to more specific localized understanding of what goes on. And so what that allows you to start doing is really focus your attention, instead of just saying, hey, I'm seeing these broad trends. Like I said, it's really diagnosing what are the drivers of that, right? Is it certain regions? Is it certain channels? Is it, how is my online business, impacting, offline? So, another example customer we have, they have their own stores, they have their own e-commerce, and they also sell through third-party e-commerce and third-party retail. So they have some distribution that they fully control, others they don't. They were introducing a new product in a totally new category for them. So it was something where, in the earlier question about new product introductions, they didn't necessarily have a lot of data to indicate, at least in this category, how things were going to perform. So the key thing was responsiveness. They had some hypotheses about where they thought this product was going to overperform. They were able to use the e-commerce data that came in faster than anything else. I mean, that's more or less real time to start kind of testing those hypotheses. And then they use that to basically influence, in-store merchandising, how prominent that product was displayed versus their other products in store. So I think that's where we generally see kind of the more advanced use of the data versus kind of the high level summary of just, hey, overall, what are customers actually doing with their products?
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks, Roger, for the question. Great insight there, Joel. So I've got one final question. We'll wrap up Q&A on this one here, Joel. I know that you do a lot of speaking, and you were here in Atlanta, the supply chain city, hashtag supply chain city, I should say, to keep my chamber friends happy, at the I for Transport conference a few months back. I think you spoke alongside leaders from Cisco and C.H. Robinson and AGCO and numerous others. Any key takeaways from your presentation or from the conference that you might share with our audience here?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we presented it at EFT. We were actually at the time presenting with Procter and Gamble, and it's actually an interesting presentation. It's a little different in the sense of the work there was talking about connecting manufacturers with their material suppliers, right? So here I've talked a lot about connecting into retailers and distributors using that data. The exact same challenge exists if I'm a material supplier selling into a manufacturer who's using my process in a production process. There, the idea was increase visibility, share data both ways so that there's an understanding of where's the inventory, how's demand, how's that different from the production plans that we had, and making sure that P&G and its material suppliers could be more responsive to what's going on. So this problem, I know the approach I've taken here is really talking a lot about through retailers and distributors, but the exact same thing is happening much further upstream. And those material suppliers are just as interested in understanding demand, which for them was production usage of their products, as many other companies might want to be about, hey, what customers are actually buying my product. So similar thing. Was fun to present and lots of interesting presentations there. So
terrific. Well, we look forward to you coming back to Atlanta, and maybe we'll tee up a live presentation of today's topic. But really, thanks for your time and perspective today, Joel. That's going to wrap up Q&A, and we're going to be concluding our session this afternoon on a few final items. First off, Supply Chain Now Radio has recently rolled out a text-to-subscribe feature for our webinars. If you are a regular attendee for our webinar programming, such as today, no need to continue to register on a one-off basis for our programs. To be auto-enrolled for each of our webinars, text supply chain to 42828. We'll take it from there. For many of y'all that sit in on these sessions for certification maintenance needs, it might make your life a little bit easier. I know we're all looking for that these days. Secondly, we'd invite our audience to join us for one of our upcoming sessions. We have a lot on the docket. We've got webinars on the labor market and the supply chain talent market coming up. We've got podcasts featuring leaders from organizations such as Kimberly-Clark, Gray Orange, the Georgia Manufacturing Alliance, much, much more. To learn more, you can check out our new website, supplychainnowradio.com. And, of course, you can always shoot me an email if you have a question that's not answered there. Thirdly, join us here in Atlanta on October 19th and 20th for our APICS Regional Supply Chain Leadership Forum, which is going to be hosted by Georgia Tech. We're pleased to be featuring site tours, networking, and some incredible professional development opportunities. To learn more, send us an email at info@apixatlanta.org, and that is this Friday and Saturday. So send us a note quick if you're interested in that. Finally, if you're interested in pursuing a supply chain management certification, a world-renowned supply chain management certification, be sure to check out our Apex Atlanta CSCP and CLTD boot camps at Georgia Tech scheduled for December 2018. Of course, you can reach out to me again if there's anything we can do to serve as a resource for you and your organization. Hey, Joel, before we conclude today's session, any final thoughts on your end?
Yeah, so we'll be sharing this presentation. There are many other additional resources to look at. This is a complex topic. There's a lot to be learned about this. So really appreciate the time that you've taken today. We'll be sharing this, but would encourage you to read more. And if you have questions, obviously I'm happy to chat and share any thoughts that I can in helping you.
Outstanding. And to our audience, again, you'll get a copy of the deck here today, and you can learn more about Alloy at alloy.ai. So as we wrap up today, we'd like to give a big thanks to our featured speaker, Joel Beal with Alloy, for this extraordinary presentation. Big thanks to our sponsors again, Apex Atlanta and Talent Stream. Of course, a big thank you to our audience for participating. On behalf of Supply Chain Now Radio, this is Scott Luton concluding today's episode. Have a wonderful week, and we hope to reconnect with you again real soon. Thanks, everybody.